Hi everyone. Today we have our guest again on the show. I'm very glad, Matthew Fulco. Hi, welcome to the show, Matthew.
Richard, it's great to be here again.
Yeah, today we are going to discuss the recent presidential visits, actually, one by the former president in China and the other one by the current president in the US. What does it mean for both the country and the region? Okay, Matthew, thank you very much, and let's listen to your take. What do you think?
Well, Richard, this is obviously a pretty important issue for Taiwan, especially with the election coming up, right, next January. So, if we think about, let's start with Ma Ying-jeou's visit, because that was not something that had been announced very far in advance. We knew that Tsai was going to visit the U.S. Probably a little bit earlier than we knew about Ma's visit. And if we think about Tsai's overall foreign policy, it's been very much leaning in the U.S. direction and away from China. Ma has been out of office for a long time. I think
Yeah.
quite some time. So, what does this visit really mean? If you ask me, I think that he doesn't represent the KMT, the Kuomintang's official stance for the 2024 election, but that viewpoint that he has about, I mean, we might say bending over backwards to try to meet the Communist Party of China halfway would represent the very conservative wing of the KMT. So he's not on any kind of formal mission. I don't think the KMT chairman, Ying-jeou, sent him there. I think this is something he wanted to do himself. But if we listen to what he said while he was in China, he was talking a lot about the past, right? He visited, of course, Sun Yat sen's mausoleum in Nanjing. He visited his ancestral village for the first time ever in Hunan. And of course, he is the first president of Taiwan to do this. So that is significant, except that he's not president anymore, right? So this isn't something that was possible, while he was president, but it's something he can do now. And he even went to Chongqing, which of course was the Republic of China's wartime capital, and he visited a cemetery where a war hero on the Chinese side was interned, or may still be interned there. And he spoke about bedtime stories he heard, against Japanese invaders. So I think that Ma's trip was ultimately really about expressing his personal sentiments, and he used the term. I mean, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but he spoke in a way that expressed the sentiment that everybody's Chinese in an ethnic sense.
Yeah, but
So
then who did he represent if it's not himself? I mean, definitely not the population, even not the voters. Maybe a small fraction of the party, or maybe was it arranged by China and he represents them? Like, who do you think did he represent in the end?
that's a great question, Richard. I think he represented that 3.5%, according to NCCU's poll,
Yeah,
who thinks
yes,
totally Chinese. I mean, that's I mean, if you look, we have 23.25 million Taiwanese, and if we look at 3% of that, it's a relatively small number. Okay, it's not even a million Taiwanese at this point, right? But if we went back to 1992, it was 25% of the
yes.
population when Taiwan was at roughly 20 million. So we're looking at going from 5 million people to 350,000. It's quite a significant drop. A lot of them have passed away who have those viewpoints. So I think that Ma's viewpoint is something that really represents Taiwan's past. If we go back, before 1987, Taiwan was officially still trying to reclaim, the entire mainland, and was representing all of China, although it,
Now,
it had.
but the damage that was done is the impression like there were two Taiwans or two societies. One, of course, one pro-US or pro the West, and the other one
Mm.
like it works for the West, for outsiders, like, oh, there is a part of the population that really wants to, go to China. So that's really a big damage.
That's a really good point, Richard. But let's be honest. I mean, there are anywhere, and I don't, I mean, this is a really, even the Taiwanese government doesn't have the exact data. There are anywhere from 650,000 to 2 million Taiwanese living in China right now. We don't have the numbers. Okay. We have a range. So we know that there are quite a few, right? And we don't know to what extent they identify with what Ma said, but certainly, the fact that there are a lot of Taiwanese still choosing to live in China with everything that's happened at least suggests, and I don't know that those people are included in NCCU's poll. That would be a great question to ask NCCU. Because if
Yeah,
we added them, then perhaps it would be a slightly larger percentage. But
that's right.
I agree with you that the optics of this trip, for somebody who wasn't clued into the cross-strait situation in detail, might suggest, with the former president visiting, that this was something that was widespread in Taiwan, and when in fact it is a minority viewpoint.
Even
Uh,
less. And then we had right before, we had Honduras switching the recognition. So it all, of course, it was not by coincidence, but it all looked really, kind of deteriorated Taiwan's image abroad.
let's go back to that point we talked about last time about how China thinks that they're doing Taiwan a favor even when they're not, because
Yeah,
in their
great. That's a great point.
in their viewpoint they were generous. Okay, they
Yes.
allowed Ma to come. They let him meet with Song Tao, from the Taiwan Affairs Office. Now, that's quite a step down from Xi Jinping in Singapore in 2015, but the Chinese are conscious rather of the optics of this situation. They don't want to do anything that would visibly or clearly compromise the chances of the pro-Beijing parties in the 2024 election. So in their view, by having Ma come and it be very cordial, and he meets with Song Tao and some local officials, in their view, they're being very generous, to Ma. But in fact, they took Honduras from Taiwan. We know that they're pushing hard for Paraguay. That's not secure at all. In terms of that ally, of course, the ruling party in Paraguay obviously wants to maintain ties, but if they don't win, I wouldn't place too much faith in that relationship enduring.
Oh, that's
Uh,
interesting.
for Paraguay, I mean, Guatemala might be a little bit more solid, but when it comes to Taiwan's diplomatic allies, Latin America has been trending in a certain direction, and it's concerning
Yeah,
from
but there
Taiwan.
is an
And
interesting fact because officially, yeah, there is less and less countries, but in practical terms, Taiwan has more and more support. I mean, we have delegations here all the time, and even high-ranking delegations. So officially, the number is decreasing, but let's say the unofficial support, the cooperation, it's actually getting better.
a very good point. I agree with you. I think the Tsai administration has done an outstanding job with regards to unofficial support. I just caution anybody who thinks that Taiwan could be fine without any diplomatic allies, because I think that plays into a narrative by China that it's not a country. So the emphasis I could be on unofficial support from key players, not just the United States, but Europe, Japan, South Korea had a delegation. India, more should be done with India for sure. But we do need to be careful about there being no countries in the world that officially recognize Taiwan. I think that if China were to try something, then one of the things that they would want to say would be that, well, Taiwan, that's a territory of ours, and look, there's not one country in the world that recognizes this country. So what are you talking about? It's not a country. It's part of China, part of the PRC. But getting back to Ma, I do think that it really was a personal mission, and I think the KMT wasn't in a position to tell him no. People who remain nameless here, but who have spoken to me off the record, seem to, from the KMT, in various parts of the KMT, told me that that they supported President Ma's personal visit to Taiwan. He expressed it was very, even though it was off the record, it was extremely diplomatic. What I personally took away from those conversations was that Ma wanted to do this visit and that the KMT leadership wasn't in a position to tell him no, but
Oh, okay.
they didn't think that this was something that was going to benefit them directly. I think
So
that's
he
fair.
did not have support within the party. Was more like his personal trip.
I believe, based on my conversations with a couple of, people in the KMT who are, in different parts of the KMT, that this was Ma's personal initiative. Nobody in the KMT is going to tell a foreign journalist they don't support the former president's visit,
Yes.
but Taiwan can be subtle, and Taiwanese can be subtle sometimes. My sense was that it's a personal trip and that they're agnostic about it. Right? They're not for or against it. But my personal viewpoint is that it didn't do them any good.
Okay,
Uh,
but now if we expand it, let's say, to whole Asia, I think it's a great example that the whole region would have soon to make a choice, who do they side with? Because it's getting more and more extreme. So I guess it's a good example to talk about the region. I mean, not necessarily now, but there should be a discussion because more and more countries would have to take a stance.
with regards to Taiwan and China.
Yeah, yeah. Who do they side with? Is it the U.S. or is it China?
Well, that's a great question. It's something I'm actually working on right now. Might have a story coming out. It's funny you read my mind. I think China. I think China hasn't done a very good job with Asia. Xi Jinping said in
Yeah, agree.
2014 at this, the name of it has a very long name. There's a regional security cooperation summit, it was in the year 2014, and he said, and this was something that of course various media picked up at the time, that the security of Asia, and I'm paraphrasing, should be left to Asians. And this was in the Obama administration when U.S.-China relations were considerably more cordial than they are now, and this obviously raised some eyebrows in the United States about exactly does he mean by that. Uh, but it happened at a time when China was embroiled in a dispute, very, very, I don't want to say, a couple of disputes, one with Vietnam over an oil rig in disputed waters, and then with Japan over the Senkakus. Now, Taiwan at the time was fine because Ma was still president. It was 2014, but China was certainly not already, was not really in it. It seemed like a strange statement for them to make, but it gave us some insight into Xi's thinking. What some people said at the time was, this sounds a little bit like Japan's co-prosperity sphere. Looks like a would-be totalitarian power saying, let's make Asia for Asians, but we're gonna control everything. Not Japan this time, obviously, but China. So if we look now, we can see that, with the exception of Myanmar in North Korea and Laos, maybe Pakistan to a certain degree, but the rest of Asia is very much hedging its bets.
Yes.
So, when getting back to the question, I don't think that that's a decision that certainly in the ASEAN countries, I don't think they're going to make that decision, because they're going to say to the U.S., well, China's here and it's the largest, if not, it's a large, if not the largest trading partner for all of us. We won't abandon China. We're not going to decouple. On the other hand, Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, maybe Brunei. Brunei may have a South China Sea dispute. I hope I'm not stating that incorrectly. I know that I'm sure that Malaysia, it does, right? It does have one. So there are a number of, and what's remarkable about Xi Jinping is that he hasn't settled one of these disputes. And in my view, that must mean that they're all core interests, Richard. Even that dispute with Brunei. So that shows an utter lack of statesmanship and strategic thinking, because
No. But Jiang Zemin did. He settled with Russia. He settled few of their disputes.
Well, you're
But yeah,
talking about a different leader, though.
yeah, yeah,
I
different
I
leader,
agree, I
different
agree
time.
with you, and so you're right, but this leader, for whatever reason, can't do that. So
Yeah,
there's been low hanging fruit the whole time. Why do you need to have a dispute with Vietnam, who's got a whole faction in its government that leans a bit towards China, and there's another one that's a little more agnostic and pro-U.S. But Malaysia obviously has a good relationship with China, but those elements that are a little suspicious, they're cognizant this dispute's still going on. The Philippines, what a lost opportunity with Duterte, and China
exactly.
completely botched
Yes,
that.
yes.
So how core an interest is the South China Sea? I mean, it's just that's that's where the U.S. they've just given the U.S. even when Trump was causing the Trump administration's policies perhaps caused some uncertainty around the world about U.S. commitments. China didn't take advantage of that to settle those disputes. And the Senkaku Islands, why can't China just shelve that like they did before? I mean, wouldn't it make sense to try to appeal to different interests in Japan that are, there's a large, even in the ruling LDP in Japan that wants to pursue a more moderate China policy, but at this point they're not very influential because of what's
Yes.
happened in the past few years. But this, to me, just it looks like an utter lack of statesmanship, an inability to move beyond appearances in domestic politics. But at the end of the day, it just allowed the U.S., even when the U.S. made some foreign policy blunders, to still kind of come back in
But
and
I think he just doesn't need to compromise. Why would he? He thinks he has the power and the means to defend it, to treat it as his. Why would he compromise? That's weakness. So he just considers it all Chinese territory. Why would he compromise?
well, he would do that because in the aggregate, he's pushing various countries away. In other words, we could say that Malaysia it will never ally with the United States, right? But Malaysia is not a very important. I mean, in terms of overall comprehensive power, is not a country that's crucial in any of these kind of situations, right? Vietnam, much more important, tends to not lean too far to one side. But the Philippines, they have been a U.S. ally for a long time, but Duterte was quite certainly earlier in his term, very ambivalent about the U.S. and China squandered that opportunity. Now the U.S. has got more basing rights than it had before, close to
Yes.
Taiwan. Does that work in China's favor? And when it comes to Japan, they're obviously the most important U.S. ally. There's a limit to what China can do, but what if China had said we should shelve the Senkaku dispute? It certainly would have made it harder for the U.S. to get Japan on board for some of these initiatives to contain China. So I just think that in foreign policy, you need to look at the bigger picture. I think for Xi Jinping, it's like you said, it's a belief that China has the power to impose its will. And for whatever reason, an inability to sort of look further or to look around and say, well, if we push it with each and every one of these countries, what's going to be the end result of that?
But we have to say, I think recently he's been doing internationally much better. You have to see the agreements. He's involved in the
Oh,
Russian-Ukrainian conflict in the Middle East.
okay,
So he's been doing well. I mean, he brought two hostile
he's
Arabic
back.
countries.
Let,
Yeah.
let me say this: he's doing well outside of his own neighborhood.
Yes.
So if we're looking at Asia, the Malaysians, the Singaporeans, that they're always amenable to doing a lot of trade with China. They have large influential diaspora populations.
Yes.
Uh, I mean, they both recently, I believe the Malaysian prime minister was in Beijing. I know um, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong was also met with Xi Jinping recently.
Yes.
That's a given. But if you look at Singapore, they gave the U.S. Rights to use their air and naval bases until is it 2039? I think in 2019 they signed another. It was either maybe 20 years, a fairly long leasing agreement to use those bases. So Singapore is certainly hedging its bets. Uh, but you're right. If we look at the recent meeting with the president of Brazil, who is a bit more left wing, uh, you're right. He certainly wants to settle trade more in Remming, not in dollars, right? In their own currencies. And if we look at, it wasn't a very successful trip, but certainly Emmanuel Macron from France obviously was very keen to get Xi's support for a resolution in Ukraine. Saudi Arabia and Iran,
Yes.
opportunistic, but nonetheless successful. Uh, and he's certainly on a whirlwind tour after the COVID exile. So
Now the
zero.
German Minister of Foreign Affairs visiting Beijing, so she's right now in Beijing. Yes, so he has a lot of people visiting him. It's a very good, image for him internally. Makes
Yeah,
him look stronger.
I agree with that, and I think that uh, if we're looking outside of the immediate region, I think China has a lot more low hanging fruit to pick. I think if we're talking about China's neighborhood, if we look back to that statement about Asia security should be left up to Asians, I mean, 9 years later, there hasn't been much progress. But I do believe that, uh, BRICS. I think it's kind of something Goldman Sachs made up, right? But there's that's where it came from. It was somebody at Goldman Sachs came up with the idea, but the idea that India, I think, is still, although they might be a little bit more leaning in the U.S. direction, I think they're still kind of non-aligned. So I don't think they're going to go too far over to China's side. And as far as cooperation with the U.S., yes, to a certain extent, absolutely, but um, not as much as Washington would hope. But Brazil and Russia and South Africa and China, perhaps they're going to do some more things together. I think that remains to be seen. But I, I think ultimately with China, when you're that formidable economically and you're that many countries' top trading partners, more than the U.S., right? You're going to be a big player. And
I have a question. Last time you also wanted to talk about the islands around Taiwan. Would you like to mention that now? You remember when
well,
we
I'm
were?
not sure if we talked about it last time, but the
No.
a couple of maybe I don't think we did, right? The outlying islands. So Jinmen
Yeah,
has
last
some.
time you wanted to mention it, so maybe we could also talk about it a bit now, okay?
Sure. Well, I
If you
just
want.
know. Yeah, I just know that it certainly doesn't represent everybody, every voter on Jinmen, but there are a couple of politicians who are in favor of a demilitarized zone. Now,
Okay.
to what degree has China influenced that? A lot, but is it united front? I mean, yeah, probably a little bit, but it's also just the experience, right? I mean, Jinmen suffered a lot from the 50s until the 70s. They had certainly Taiwan Island didn't have any casualties. Jinmen did. It was heavily fortified. It had a huge military presence on it. It was involved in the Taiwan Strait crises in the 50s, and it was shelled, on and off. I think it was only on, was it even days? It was every other day or even or odd until 1977 or 78. So there's some justification for them to say they don't really, especially with the level of integration they have with Fujian province. Technically they're actually part of Fujian province, but let's just say the PRC. They're not Taiwan. They're Fujian province under the ROC. But to the degree that they're integrated, certainly during my trips there, I've been there 3 times. People have always, made that point. But I do think that Taiwan, Taiwanese government in Taipei certainly needs to be cognizant of that and the fact that these islands get a lot of benefits from being Taiwan. okay, compared to what they might get if they were China. But due to the proximity, that they're probably, I don't want to say they're lost, but they're certainly a little bit more China leaning than the rest of Taiwan. So when you have Shi Mingde, right, who was a former
Yeah,
DPP chairperson who went to prison for being in the Dang Wai, and has been out of, not been an important person in Taiwan politics for a long time, but who of course was leading the anti-corruption campaign against Chen Shui-bian, and he's come out with this. He was, I don't want to say he's the first person, but he's certainly one of the leading voices for this demilitarization of Jinmen and Matsu. So I do think Taiwan needs to pay attention to that. From a strategic standpoint, those, because of China's capabilities now, those islands are no longer what they were in the late 1940s. They're not the gateway to Taiwan, right?
I still have a question I would like to ask you. What do you
Sure.
think? What job is the government doing with regard to, let's preparing the society for what's coming? Because you see, we had those exercises now around Taiwan with regard to size meetup
Sure.
in the
Well,
US, and everybody here is relaxed and peaceful. It looks like like the frog that is boiling so slowly. I
I just
People don't
so
care.
I think that's a great point, Richard. One part of me wants to say, maybe it's time to push people a little bit more. On the other hand, I think they have a sense of what China wants to do and what it doesn't want to do. My sense of Taiwan from all my time there, and I guess not quite as long as you, but it was about almost 12 years. I think Taiwanese are very capable of turning on a dime and mobilizing, as they did for the coronavirus when it became evident that that was a threat. But I don't think they're going to do it proactively when the threat is not manifest. That's just my personal viewpoint. I don't think they're going to do it, and that's why. And so when I say they're not going to do it, that doesn't mean not beefing up the military or acquiring more weapons or training more with the U.S. That's all going to be done because it doesn't require a sacrifice from
Yes.
the average citizens. But if we're talking about, some of these ideas from people in the U.S., give everybody a right. I mean, no, it's not. Look, it's not the U.S. It's not Ukraine. It's not Finland, right? It's just not. So it's not Israel. It's not Korea. So every country has kind of there are differences culturally. So I think that, but if the threat becomes manifest, I have confidence that Taiwanese people would be able to turn to pretty quickly mobilize and do what they had to do. I'm talking about the citizens.
Yes.
Preparing the standing military is a separate question. And I think they do need, I think they're aware and they're doing more, and they need to do even more with the US
So
and
you
Japan.
you have more confidence in them than I do, because I'm actually disappointed. There is not much happening, not much going on, and as they say, when the shit hits the fan, I guess it's a bit too late. They have a lot of signals, they have a lot of warnings now,
Mm.
and they don't. No one reacts. So I'm actually disappointed. I think they should be doing much more now, not in the last
They
moment.
could, well, I agree with you. They could be, but just culturally, I don't. I mean, I don't know to what extent it's really about elections. Everybody in Taiwan always says, "Oh, yeah, 选举," but maybe, but I just think it's cultural in the sense that this is not a perfect analogy, but they were not outstanding on anti-money laundering until Megabank got in trouble with the Panama Papers, and then like you never saw legislation passed faster in Taiwan than after the Federal Reserve Bank of New York fined Taiwan a large amount, and the mega branch in New York was put on the spot, and that was really embarrassing. And the Asia Pacific Money Laundering Group was looking at Taiwan intently and was going to downgrade them, or they might have. And Taiwan had previously been downgraded. And so I think that when that happened, they moved very fast
Okay.
to mitigate. Now, it's not a perfect analogy because it's a potential kinetic threat versus money
Yeah, no,
laundering.
but the citizens had nothing to do with it. It's just the government going after, money
Right.
laundering.
but it's just a kind of a a cultural thing that sometimes they're not. Maybe it's also that you act too much and people it will affect you in the elections. Perhaps I do think that that's a factor that they're concerned about. To what extent do they really need to prepare? I mean, it's one of those things where they can always say, well, it hasn't happened yet, right? But I agree with you that if they get caught off guard, it could be a problem.
Matthew, I want to really thank you. I enjoyed it a lot, and I hope we can do this again.